In this video, I want to talk to you about how to keep a record of what you do in lab. And we call that record the lab notebook, which is, of course, very important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it so much. It helps you remember what you did and when you did it. It helps you figure out, sometimes things don't go right. You don't get what you expect. And so the lab notebook can be very important in helping you figure out what you might have done wrong. It's also very important because often somebody might want to, especially if you're doing synthesis or something like that, people might want to reproduce what you've done. And finally, it can be a legal document. Like, for example, if you were working in an industrial lab and discovered a new drug and it came time for the patent and another company had discovered the same drug, they might use the lab notebooks, or they would use the lab notebooks to determine who had precedence in that discovery. So it's very, very important. And the key takeaway is right here is, when looking at what you've done in your lab notebook, think, if this was somebody else's lab notebook, could I take it and could I do the lab? And one of the other things to remember is that that might not just be, you have good memories, you can remember what you did, but what if you wanted to try to remember what you'd done a year from now, or somebody else had to read what you'd done 3 years from now and try to figure out how to reproduce it? That's the kind of clarity that your lab notebook needs to have. So, what does your lab notebook need to be? Well, first off, it needs to be bound, not a spiral notebook like this. That is not appropriate for lab. Here's an example of a lab notebook that has the binding on it and it doesn't have tear out pages and all the pages are bound in. But it doesn't have to be a black, boring comp book. You can have some fun with it. Have your favorite band on the front. I don't care. Just you need to have one of these. You want to be sure that you have your name and contact info in there in case you lose your notebook. We're going to leave the first 3 or 4 pages blank for a table of contents. You want to number all of your pages. And usually what you're going to do is you're going to number your pages in the upper right-hand corner. Yes, you can number them down here too. That's all right. But usually the upper right-hand corner is the best place to number them. All notes you make in your lab notebook must be in ink, not in pencil. We never write in our lab notebook in pencil. You want to be sure that you date all your pages and all your entries so you know when you did certain parts of your lab work. You should write in your lab notebook the day that you do the experiment, so it should be up to date, not a week later. I'll talk more about what the right-hand rule is. And also, I'm going to talk more in a minute about before every lab, you need to do a pre-lab in your lab notebook. Okay, so here's your notebook. And so we've skipped a few pages. And here's the first page of our lab notebook. And the first question you might have is, what is the right-hand rule? Well, what that is this think you are only going to make notes on this side, the right hand side. You're only going to make notes there. That's going to be where the official record of what you did in lab is going to be. So you're asking yourself, well, what is this side of the page for? Notice I also added in a date right there. So what is this left-hand side of the page for? Well, consider it like a scratch pad. You can draw faces on it. You could use it to take quick notes next to the balance, and then you're going to transfer that information over here to write in your lab notebook, because I'm not going to see this side of the page. I'm never going to look at it. The only parts of the notebook I'm going to look at are the parts that are on this right-hand side. So there's some reading posted in Canvas. It'll give you a little more information about the right-hand rule, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about what to write in your lab notebook. Okay, let's spend a couple minutes talking about what is in a pre-lab. So in your notebook, what's going to be written in a pre-lab is you're going to start off with the title of the experiment. So there it is in your lab notebook, your title of your experiment. The next thing is going to be a reaction, if applicable. It's not going to be applicable in these first few labs, but if you did have a reaction, so there's an example of what your reaction would look like, and then you'd want to have a list of reagents, which has the chemical structures and formulas, pertinent physical data, amounts that you're going to be using, and this will not apply for the first few labs, but you'll need to have the theoretical yield when you do the reaction. So that's one of the things you need. Separately, what you want to have is you want to have an outline of the procedure. So on a separate sheet of paper, I want you to read the handout, and then I want you to make a short outline or plan of what you're going to be doing during lab. And this is just for you to give yourself a chance to look at the lab handout and then summarize the things you're going to be doing so that you are able to be more efficient when you come into lab in carrying out the procedure. Okay, so how am I going to find all this information? Well, the title of the experiment, it is right there on the handout. The reaction, I promise you, if there's a reaction, that one's going to be on the handout too. The list of the reagents, the chemical structures or formulas, those are often in the handout. The physical data, that's sometimes in the handbook, in the handout, but you can also find it in reference books, and we're going to talk about databases. The amounts of substances that you might be using, those are usually in the handout, and then they may be given in the handout in moles, but the balances weigh in grams, so you may need to do some conversions. But this week you're not going to have to do any of that. But you are going to have some chemicals that you're going to be using, and we're going to need to look up some physical data on those chemicals. Here are all the chemicals that you're going to be using in the lab next week, and these should all look pretty familiar because many of them you used, almost all of them you used in the lab last week when we were testing solubilities. The only new chemical would be this molecule called acetanilide, and we did actually discuss, phenacetin, I take that back, that's the new one. And so those are the compounds you're going to need to look up this week. All of not just these two compounds, but all of these compounds. What do you not look up? Well, when you look at the lab handout, you'll see that here's a chemical reaction. It's the one where you take aspirin and make it water soluble by turning it into the sodium salt of aspirin, or sodium acetylsalicylate. And you don't have to look up this reaction. You don't have to look up the sodium salt because you're not going to isolate this. You don't have to put this reaction because you're not isolating the sodium salt. So this doesn't have to be in your pre-lab. So where do you look up these physical and chemical properties of the compounds that you're going to be using in lab? CRC Handbook of Chemistry and Physics, that's physical and also online. That's a place to look it up. ChemSpider is a free database by the Royal Society of Chemistry in the United Kingdom, and you can search by name or structure. SciFinder is a not free database from the American Chemical Society, and you can also search for name by name and structure. So there's many places you can look, but here are three common ones. And for this week's lab, I want you to use ChemSpider to look up information on the chemicals. Okay, what do you need to look for in ChemSpider? So you can search for the compound by the name or by the structure, and you should be able to, one of the first things you're going to see is you're going to see the molecular weight. So here's the ChemSpider search screen, and so acetyl chloride would be an example of a chemical you could search for. And this is the first result that you had, the only result that you got for acetyl chloride. And you can see here is they have what's called the average mass. That is your molecular weight. And they give it in Daltons, and Daltons is just grams per mole. So there's your molecular weight. So that's something you need. If you scroll down on this page, you can see all the different ways to name this molecule in German, French, and Spanish, and other alternative names in English. But what we're more interested in right now is the properties. So we're going to click on that tab, and we're going to see a lot of physical properties like the experimental melting point, the experimental boiling point. Those are the two most important ones. And if I click on, say, the experimental melting point, what I'm going to see is a number of different melting points. So you can just pick the top one. That's fine. That's minus 112 degrees. And then you would want to go through and get the other data. Like, for example, this is actually supposed to say boiling point. So you'd want to have a boiling point, also a melting point, and there'll be a button that's called appearance, and just scroll down until you see a short description of what the material looks like. And then also there should be a button called safety, and look for some text that says something like warning, irritate skin and eyes, harmful if swallowed. So what you want to have, just to summarize, is you want to have a boiling point, a melting point. You want to have the appearance of the compound, and you want to have a short safety description in addition to the molecular weight and the structure. Okay, once you've got all that done, your pre-lab is done in your lab notebook, and you should scan it and upload it to Canvas, and we want to get it about 24 hours before lab so we can review it and give you some feedback. And what do you write during lab? Well, you write down what you do and what you see. And I don't mean that like you have to be doing chemistry with your left hand and writing with your right hand. What you'll find is that you can, be doing things, and then there's going to be a period where you're going to have to wait. That's a good time to catch up and get your lab notebook organized. And you should check out, there's a link in Canvas in Lab 1. Lab 2 information that has a lot of has some examples of what to write in your lab notebook, what that looks like, and more detailed information on keeping a lab notebook. So you should check that out and ask me or ask us any questions that you have. Just a couple final words on notebooks. Don't forget to number all the pages, date everything that you do. Don't try to be perfect. And if you do make a mistake, just draw a line through it. But do be complete, be organized, and keep everything up to date.